Changing firms can mean an overwhelming amount of work and disruption. But my friends, I have been through 3 firm changes myself, and I can tell you that if God is calling you to make the leap, then He can be trusted with the details. I would also encourage you to just keep your eye on the prize, looking forward to that eternal fruit that will come as you are free to more fully transform your business into a ministry, actively building the kingdom through your client relationships. Today, I'm going to walk you through 4 spiritual principles to help you think rightly about your situation before you make any decisions. They are, first, recognize the source of your discontentment. Second, lean in and listen to God's voice. 3, put out the right kind of fleece. And fourth, discern your priorities and God's priorities for your work. Let's start with recognizing the source of your discontentment. If you're watching this video, odds are you've been experiencing some discontentment for a while now. Discontentment can be a pry bar that dislodges us from familiar or complacent state of mind. It can be an indicator that it's time for a change. When God is ready to move us and propel us into our next season, it often starts with an unsettled or discontented feeling, or simply longing for something more. Yet there are times when discontentment is a tool that the enemy will use to keep us distracted and ineffective in our calling or assignment. 1 Timothy 6:6 reminds us that godliness with contentment is great gain. It's important to acknowledge that contentment ultimately is an inside job. A change of external circumstances won't necessarily improve our internal atmosphere. Sometimes, the only change that's needed is in our attitude. Here are some questions that will help you discern if your discontentment should propel you into your next level, or simply it's a time to adjust and be grateful and stay put. First of all, how did you end up at your current firm? Did God call you to your current position? If so, do you sense that you've accomplished all He's called you to do at your current firm? These questions will help guard you against the temptation to abandon your post if you're not supposed to leave. Some of us are called, at least for a season, to be a square peg in a round hole. Some of us are called to agitate and catalyze change within our current firm. Here's a hint. If you find yourself drawn to intercede for cultural change within your firm and called to build relationships with the leaders, this could be you. I've been a square peg in a round hole at one of my previous firms, and I know how uncomfortable that can be. But I also saw a lot of good fruit that came from it. Even though it was uncomfortable, God was in it. I was given tremendous favor in my request to onboard faith-driven investment funds and host quarterly advisor training calls on faith-driven investing. Today, I'm thankful for that season, even though in many ways it was a difficult one. That season didn't last forever either. I sensed the Lord was telling me that I would know it was time to move on when my requests were declined and I started hearing no more often. Now, thankfully, when that happened, I was able to leave with my relationship still intact, and with the assurance that I was not abandoning my post, but that it truly was time for me to move on. Which brings me to my second principle. We've got to lean in and listen to God's voice. As with all major life decisions, the single most important thing for us to do is hear God's voice. The circumstances of your life have been uniquely designed and orchestrated by a loving God who desires a close relationship with you. If you're considering a firm change, you probably have many questions and concerns, maybe even some fears. Don't waste this season of struggling. Let the discomfort propel you into a deeper level of connectedness with God Himself. Hearing God's voice is what gives us the courage to take big steps of faith. Romans 10:17 says, faith comes through hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. Now, the Greek term here used for word is not logos, the written word, but rhema, the spoken word. Now, God can and often does speak to us through His written word, the Bible. He also will speak to us through the words of a friend, spouse, or teacher. He'll even get our attention through dreams or unusual circumstances, but the reality is, it can be difficult to discern what is really God's voice and what is not. And there are no shortcuts to learning how to hear him. It requires faith. It requires reading the scriptures, more time in prayer, and a surrendered heart. Finally, it requires spiritual risk-taking. That is, taking real risk in order to walk in obedience to the best of our ability. With practice and with this risk-taking, we get better and better at discerning the voice of our shepherd. The word that he speaks to our hearts comes with timely relevance, practical wisdom for our unique circumstances, and a conviction in our conscience that reveals what his righteousness looks like in our lives and in our decisions. Right before my first firm change, I was driving into downtown one morning, feeling the knot in my stomach as I often did when I approached the city and the high-stress environment of my firm. Right there in the car, I heard God speak to my heart, and he said, "You're released from this firm." I had no idea where I was released to, but I pondered this in my heart and prayed over it for a few days. Then, unexpectedly, I heard him again when I went to visit another advisor in the area to talk about his Kingdom Advisor study group. Again, the Lord whispered to my heart, and as I looked around the peaceful suburban office setting with the quiet traffic and the comfortable furnishings, I heard God's voice again, this time saying, "The Father knows how to give good gifts to his children." Somehow, I knew right then that I would soon be working in this lovely office with the kind and generous advisor who owned it. Maybe you think God won't speak to you like he did to me. Maybe it sounds too good to be true. Hebrews 11:6 tells us, "Without faith, it's impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him." Many of us stop at simply believing he exists. We believe he's real, but we have learned the wrong lessons from our past disappointments. We're not sure that he's going to reward us as we seek him. Learning how to hear the voice of the Lord for ourselves and then surrendering and obeying his voice in order to bring him glory is the goal and purpose of this lifetime. I believe it's a zero-risk investment if you spend more time seeking his presence. I know that you will not get to heaven and regret all the time you wasted trying to discern God's voice. Our next principle is to put out the right kind of fleece, if needed. Once when I was working at an independent broker-dealer, I found myself positioned to be the natural successor of a large practice with a highly effective, ethical, and well-established team. On the outside, it looked like the perfect situation for a young advisor. But I was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the idea of partnering with these senior advisors who were unequally yoked. Even though they acted with integrity and seemed to put clients' interests first, we were not serving the same master. As the senior advisors with the client relationships, I knew that their influence over me would be greater than my influence over them, and I was not comfortable following any leader that wasn't following Jesus. My instinct was to move on, but again, I didn't want to abandon my post, and I really just wasn't hearing much from God on the situation. So I laid out a fleece. Now, if you don't know the story about the fleece, Gideon wanted to confirm God's will for his life before he took on a huge risk to walk in obedience. Some might say theologically that Gideon's is not a good example to follow, and that the fleece concept was really just reluctant obedience rather than faith. But there I was, sincerely seeking confirmation that God was calling me to make yet another firm change, which seemed unwise. I was doing my best to find and follow God's will. So I prayed a simple prayer that felt rather silly at the time. I think I even laughed about it. I said, "Lord, I believe you probably would not have me stay and form a partnership with these two men who are not equally yoked and do not serve you. But I also know that this situation could bring a huge benefit to my family and could allow me to build your kingdom through increased generosity. So if you want me to stay here, I ask you to confirm it by sending me two million-plus-dollar clients by the end of the year. Notice my fleece worked out in such a way that obeying what I felt God was probably showing me would be the default. I prayed this prayer in November. Now, December 31st came and went, the end of the year, no new clients, and I resolved to move on. Interestingly, on January 2nd and again on January 6th, I received random phone calls from $2 million-plus-dollar investors who wanted to speak with me about my services. Surprisingly, they both ended up becoming clients. Now, some of you might be thinking that early January is close enough, and perhaps I should have stayed put. But here's the thing about God. He's never early and he's never late. He's always perfectly on time. With his provision of these 2 new clients, I felt the quiet confidence that he was with me, and he would continue to provide for my family as he always had, without me needing to compromise the convictions he had put in my heart. A good fleece will default to follow what you suspect God is showing you. The last principle is know your priorities and then know God's priorities. Now, there's a long list of advisor criteria when choosing a firm that will feel like home. But it's important to understand that these criteria are not all equally important. Some would make life a little more convenient, while others are absolutely mission critical. Start by making 2 lists: God's priorities, which are the non-negotiables, and your preferences, which are negotiable. The criteria you may discern as God's priorities could include things like this. First, the leadership of the firm must operate with integrity and honesty. My clients must have access to investments that align with their biblical values. I must be free to use the eternal word of God when counseling my clients. Finding a partner or a successor who is equally yoked and will be a positive influence on my clients. Some criteria that might fit into your preferences, on the other hand, would include things like this: a turnkey asset management solution, marketing support, access to certain software or a particular custodian. Do you hear the difference? Priorities that are derived from biblical wisdom reflect God's priorities for our business, and they carry more weight. If you have a client who does not want to profit from abortion or slave labor, and you have to talk them into using an investment solution that doesn't fit their values because it's all your firm offers, I believe that's a big problem. On the other hand, if you get stuck doing a little extra manual work because some of the software doesn't integrate as well as you wish it did, that's something you can probably live with. I've adapted Ron Blue's decision-making matrix with my list of priorities and preferences from my last firm change. You should have received a link to download it, and you can customize it for your own use. Your categories won't match mine exactly, and that's okay. You can go through this and the other practical resources assembled within this course with prayer. We've walked through 4 spiritual principles together to help you make this move really well. First, recognizing the source of your discontentment. Second, lean in and listen to God's voice. Third, put out the right kind of fleece. And 4, discern your priorities and God's priorities for your work. Each of these can help us set ourselves up for success and right thinking when considering a firm change. However, keep in mind that sometimes, even after we make a careful, prayerful decision, with every effort to follow the voice of God and plan appropriately, we often face adversity. It's like an initial test of trust. Transitions can be difficult and fraught with uncertainty about which clients will follow, disappointments that some don't, and even legal challenges. The work involved those first few weeks can feel like you've stepped right into an MMA fight ring. Now, when the Israelites came out of Egypt, they came out with signs and wonders and all the plunder that they took with them from Egypt. There was no doubt great rejoicing and a high degree of confidence in God. And yet the next thing they knew, they were facing Pharaoh's army with the Red Sea to their backs. Suddenly, it didn't seem so obvious that God was really in it. As you go through your firm migration, expect great challenges. I've come to believe that difficulty is not as often a sign of a bad choice as it is often a symptom of doing something righteous. Committing to God's path requires us to stand on his promises when the going gets tough. Isaiah 50 verse 7 says, "Because the sovereign Lord helps me, I will not be disgraced. Therefore I have set my face like a flint, and I know I will not be put to shame." One final word of encouragement. God promises that when you seek him, you will find him when you seek him with all your heart. Whether your move is relatively simple or ends up being very difficult, stay hungry for God himself. Let the uncertainty of the change stir up your appetite to know him more. And finally, Matthew 6:33. Seek first the kingdom and his righteousness, and all of these things will be added unto you as well.